Unfortunately, you all are now stuck in my English class. That is 100% what I wanted to say. And if David and everyone else thought that they got off the hook, you 100% are not. So I hope that you are comfortable being stuck here with me. But what we are going to dive into is, why are we banning books?
Mm.
And I wanted to look at that specifically through an investigation of Richard Wright. So, David, can you still hear me? Because you're stuck now. You were the
No,
handoff, which means you're stuck with me.
I ain't going anywhere, man. I ain't going anywhere. I'm
All
right
right,
here with you.
brilliant. So why do we ban books? Like, what has been the tactics? What has been the reasoning behind banning books?
You asking me that question?
Oh, yes, I'm 100% asking you. You are now my student. You represent everyone in the chat.
Okay, you got it. We ban books because we think there's something dangerous about the content that is somehow going to supposedly hurt us.
Okay.
Now,
So,
that's the stated reason. That's the stated reason.
mhm. So in Richard Wright's first book, one of his first major ones, Uncle Tom's Children, he actually had a problem with it. And so he details one of the things that you and Dr. Terry have outlined incredibly well. He talks about lynching. He talks intimately about the violence that he sees perpetrated against Black people, but he said he had a problem with it because by the end of that book, he felt that he had made it too accessible, right? Like he
Mm,
said that people were still able to smile and find joy
mm,
in it.
mm-hmm.
He's like, if I can do that, if I can take one of the most heinous things that you can do to a person and you can still smile after it, I
Yeah.
didn't do my job. And
Mm,
so he says, I swore that if I ever wrote another book, no one would weep. It would be hard. It would be deep. It would
mm,
belie the deepness of the experience. And so, one of the things that I want us to think about, a fundamental reason that we ban some books and not all, is because they are books that you cannot easily walk away from, right? Like, we
mm,
don't ban the ones that are like Pringle, right? Like that you could read it now and then throw it away. We ban the ones that require you to really dive deep into what does it mean to be human and who
mm,
are we as it. And so, with that in mind, Richard Wright always, his work delves with a few core themes. And so I wanted to lay them out as plainly as put, but poverty is violence. Start right there. All of his characters at some point experience poverty. And so he ties this very intimately to racism leads to poverty. Poverty is violence. Poverty, racism, these otherings force us to have this search for belonging. And he also draws these very clear lines, right? Like racism leads to poverty, poverty is violence, violence begets violence. And so there is always this idea of murder, attack, harm, right? These tropes that you and Dr. Terry also talked about, where they look at these violent Black people, right?
mm.
We see that come up as a lot of the ground for why we have laws to protect folks. But what he dives into is, where do you think that violence comes from? Or like, what was the first violence that was done against the
Mm.
people? And if they don't have agency over their lives, if they don't have the opportunity to determine themselves, if they don't have the opportunity to manifest their destiny, for lack of a better term, actually, I could think of a better term. I just like saying manifest destiny, and you all can't stop me, so it's great. Um, if they don't have that opportunity, then what are they going to do to take agency? And so often their characters kill. And you see it with Bigger Thomas, you see it with Cross Damon. It is this agency that they're finally able to take something from people. And often that culminates in what he really puts out is this search for belonging. And there's a
Mm.
problem with it, right? Because we often identify, why would people join gangs? Why would people join these different parties? It is because this nihilistic nature that we see at the hands of racism. Because racism is violent, right? Like, we think so often of the policies and things like the lack of voting and all this, but racism in and of itself, what it takes away from people, perpetrates a violence, and that it rips you away from a community that you can naturally find kinship in. It rips you away from yourself. And so we look for it, right? Like, all of his characters, they constantly are on this hunt for, how am I going to make my life mean something? How am I going to find community in other people? And so you see that he deals with communism, big part of his book, because they've always promised the escape of economics, right? Think about it. If he's saying poverty is violence, there is a conflict between racism and poverty, and a group is promising that we will abolish poverty, it seems like an enticing nature, right? But what does he always find? You cannot separate race from economics. You can't. All of his characters always find themselves, and so often literature from this period, you can be communist, you're just going to be a black communist. You can be a Democrat, you're just going to be a black Democrat. You can be any part of this group, but you will be the black version of it. And so in that othering, you are still perpetrating violence, even if the economic lenses are removed. And so when we're talking about this banning of books, we have to be mindful of what have we banned, right? Why are we doing it? Well, one of the fundamental things that I've always believed in my English class is books are the best friend to people who have no one else to turn to at times. And he talks about writing as he sends words into a void, right? He says he has no clue if people will ever read it, has no clue if people will hear it, if someone else is going through the exact same thing. But when you are under oppressive systems, the best thing you can do is to cast those words out. And so I often think about this teaching. I think about a lot of the conversations that we had with Mr. Zellner, Mr. Mulvin. You have no idea what those words are going to do, if they're going to fall on deaf ears. But the best chance you get is to make sure that they're out there. Hmm. And so when we think about why was he banned, right? Like these are the three biggest reasons that Richard Wright was always there. He instigated hatred between the races. There was violence, sex, and profanity, and they were unnecessarily violent, which I always find fun because no one has been more violent than the Klan, right? No one's been more violent than white supremacists. No one has instigated hatred between the races more than the Confederacy, even though they lost. Dr. David has found out that my favorite game is what lasted longer than the Confederacy. Anyone who would like to have a side channel of that, you are more than welcome to join me. But these have become key things for banning books, and not just Richard Wright, but when we look at a lot of the laws and propositions that are being put forward about why we want to get rid of books, we're not comfortable. Well, powers that be are not comfortable with violence on an individual level. They're comfortable with it on an institutional level. They're not comfortable with murder. They're comfortable with genocide in some ways, right? Like the erasure of cultures, the erasure of identity is perfectly fine. The violence and the hatred that comes from poverty, that comes from hunger, those things are okay. But when you look at what happens when you press a person, those are things that we're supposed to do away with. And so we look at authors like Richard Wright in the past, but you see it now, right? With The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas, the way that Children of Blood and Bone has been written to put violence at in front of us so that we can't look away. Because in these fictional spaces, we're able to grapple with the harsh realities of the world that we live in, but we can still step back. And so by banning books, yes, we are banning history. Those things are true. All of the ideas that go along with them, 100%. But what we're actually taking away is the imaginative space for people to grapple with the harm that's done in their everyday lives and come out of it. If you are able to read about a character that can suffer violence and still have hope, then it gives you a blueprint for how to do so. Mm-hmm. If you take that away, then you've just taken away someone else's blueprint for how am I going to survive this? You've taken away a cautionary tale if they can't see that, hey, this is what happens when you press someone so far. You remove that liminal space that we are so good at existing in. And there are oftentimes arguments that the reason people of marginalized communities are so good at fiction is because we have to believe in worlds that don't exist.
Yeah.
And so we're banning these spaces because we are relying on this idea that this world could be different. I'm going to ban your opportunity for escapism because you need to be grounded right here in the harm and violence that I'm doing. So there is no outside fantastical world where you can escape to. There is no lion, witch, and wardrobe for Black kids to escape through. There is no, Hagrid coming and telling little trans kids or little Latinx kids that they're wizards, because that escapism has never been for them. But if we're able to fight for these things, if we're able to hold these imaginative spaces true, then what we maintain is hope. And not just for us, the posterity, the future belief that our imaginations cannot be contained, and that as long as that void for us to send words into, for us to galvanize one another, for us to grapple with things that are too big, too dark, and too dangerous for us to fight with here in our everyday lives, like that's where we're able to do it at times. Not everyone is going to be as bold as some of our freedom fighters, but everyone can pick up a book. Everyone can look at that and grapple with the moral underpinnings of what it means, because we can understand that in that text, racism, violence, poverty are wrong. And then we can extrapolate it to our lives. And so by banning books, by banning these notorious authors, what we're actually taking away are people's safe spaces to actually grapple with the things that they really need to. You are removing an individual's opportunity of doing self-work with a person that cannot judge them, cannot hurt them, can only help them because that character does not change even if the reader does.
Man, that's really
And
good.
so here's my favorite slide of any presentation I've ever done in my classes. There is always a so what, right? So why does all of this matter? Because they're banning books, because there is a massive push to take this literature away, because there has continually been an assault on the imagination of people of color, of marginalized communities, what we're seeing is it is harder for us to imagine a world outside of what we know. You see it with Bigger Thomas, which is the key character in Native Son. Bigger says that he does not feel as though he has actually taken ownership over his life until he is killed. And when he is on the stand, what finally comes out of him is anger, but it comes from a very deep place of pain. And he says that there was nowhere else I could express this. If we are not giving these spaces for reading, for writing, if we're not giving these traditional authors, these books that truly ground us in the quintessential human experience, what humanity are we taking away, and what opportunities to be seen and validated are we taking away from our students, from our families, from our parents? And so that's the so what. Richard Wright is an amazing author. He also was the person that helped get James Baldwin, Gwendolyn Brooks, and others published. And he faded into obscurity because he went way out there. But I think if we can look at someone who really did say, I am going to put the violence that you do to us so plainly in your face that you cannot deny that it exists, that's what this teaching is about, right? Like that's what our education is about. Make it so blatant that there is no way you could laugh or cry after it. The only thing you can do is grapple with how could human beings do that, and what will I do now that I know that it's not just happening to fictional characters. And so that was my setup, my roundabout way of saying, why do we ban books? Well, that's why.
Awesome. Can you let me Jordan, I learned some really good things there, and I appreciate it, man. There's like this muscle in my body, like I call learning or something, and it digs when it's getting a workout. All right, so I appreciate that. Can I ask you one question here? Can you take what you just had to say and bring it very personal to you? Can you take what you just had to say and bring it very personal? Is there a book? Is there a text that did that for you? Or there might have been multiples, but can you talk about one?
One of the books that legitimately changed my life is The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. And what I will stand on is, I think we had Dr. J earlier, and we've had a few other people who have spoken about their faith and that journey. But the Sparrow is about a group of Jesuits who go to a planet that is close enough for us to actually visit, right? And it's told backwards. The only person that returns is Father Emilio Sandoz. And the entire book is figuring out what in the world happened to his entire group. But what we actually come to figure out is it reveals the limitations of language, the limitations of knowing. And it takes its title from a verse that says, "Not one sparrow falls to the ground without his father knowing." Because, yeah, but the sparrow still falls. And I think I look at so many of our people who are constantly under attack, right? And it's all well and good for us to have elected officials, for us to have people who care and say, I see them and I understand what they're going through. Like, that's great that you see them, but those people are still suffering. Those sparrows are still falling.
Yeah.
Those individual people's lives are still being impacted. And so I think that was one of the ones that kind of helped crystallize a lot of what I've read before amongst a ridiculous amount of others. But I think when we really look at how do we get out of this? How do we grapple with it? Not everyone has boxing gloves that can go up against the entirety of the state of Florida, but I think it's why their major assault was on the imaginative space and the escapism that is possible through literature.
Okay, one quick follow-up question, then we're gonna move it over to Jamie. All right, yeah. So students contemplating taking your class or another class, and you're going to tell them the reason why they should be taking the class that you're teaching is why.
The reason you should take my class. Oh man, that's crazy. Because I would 100% don't take my class unless you are fully prepared to be radicalized, right?
Well, that's why but that's what you're saying in essence is like that's why they should take it.
No. So here's my actual answer and what I used to tell my students at the beginning of every school year, flat out, because I believed in teaching humanities, which meant I do not believe that we can teach history without teaching English, and we cannot teach English without teaching history for this fundamental reason. History teaches us the cycles of power and oppression that constantly reveal themselves, right? Everyone says history is doomed to repeat itself. Well, the other problem with that is those of us who learn from history are stuck here with the idiots who didn't learn it the first time, right? The other thing is English teaches us how individuals dealt with that. So literature teaches us how people remained human and hopeful amidst those systems of oppression. So it's one thing to teach about World War II. It's another thing to read the Diary of Anne Frank and find out the symbolism of a mirror or a window and seeing the outside world. It's one thing to look at these historical events as ahistorical events that happened on a timeline. It's another to read about how people were visualizing a world beyond that. And so whenever we need to look at what is possible, we write and we read and we believe that something different can happen, even if we have to believe in integrity and morality that individuals have never shown us.
Jordan, I have all respect, man. All respect for you and for everybody on that trip, but I appreciate you. It's 12:35 your time if you're in Chicago, and really appreciate you. Thank you so much. All right, I look forward to seeing you again in person.
Love y'all. See you later.